All right, welcome everybody to another author chat here on SFF Addicts, and I'm very, very happy today to be talking with Tasha Suri. She's the award-winning author of the Books of Ambha duology and the epic fantasy The Jasmine Throne, book one in her Burning Kingdom series. And when she isn't writing, Tasha likes to cry over TV shows, buy too many notebooks, and indulge her geeky passion for reading about South Asian history. And her latest release is the Oleander Sword, which is out now via Orbit Books when everybody ends up listening to this podcast. And I'm very happy to have you here, Tasha, and congratulations on the release of this new book.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm so excited that the book is out. Well, out when this is seen by people, but also it's out very soon for us now. So that's really
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah. And I mean, before we get into your work and everything,
Mhm.
how have you been lately? And what's it like releasing sort of like your second pandemic book?
Oh, it's actually my third pandemic book, I think. No, is it my second? I can't even remember when the pandemic began anymore. It's so long. So, yeah, things have been good for me. I'm working on the third book in the trilogy at the moment.
Hmm.
But the Jasmine Throne came out during the pandemic, as did my YA book, What Souls Are Made Of. And this book is, I guess, still a pandemic book because the pandemic is, at least technically and
Yeah.
in reality, not over. So that's been interesting. It's been hard, but it's also been really nice to have like the online writing community and have
Mm.
like readers and have people to just talk books to, because I think having that outlet makes the stress a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah. And it certainly makes up for the lack of face to face contact with people. I've spoken to
Yes.
a few authors who are doing things that are similar to book tours, are not really
Mhm.
as expansive as they used to be. They're a little bit more intimate and whatnot, but it seems like things
Yes.
are starting to get back into the pre-pandemic churn, but still there's that like crazy crossover, and a lot of people are finding a lot of value in virtual connections or virtual book tours or things like we're doing right now.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit before recording started, but a lot of my readers are in the US or worldwide.
Hmm.
And I don't really go to the US much because it's quite far away. Um, and it's, so you don't get to do in person events, you don't get to see those readers, you don't get to sign books
Yeah.
for them. So the one good thing about the pandemic was that I could do online events, which meant that I could see or kind of speak to or speak, with readers from all across the world, and also do events with other authors that I wouldn't necessarily be in the same
Yeah.
space with. So that's been really, really rewarding. I've also had the chance to do a few in-person events recently as things have opened up a bit. Particularly at I did one Sapphic trifecta event with CL Clark and Shelley
Yeah.
Parker
Yeah. I
Chan,
saw
which
that.
was so
Oh,
fun. And an event with Samantha Shannon and Sarah El Arifi. So all of that kind of thing was really great. But I am going to miss it if online events become less of a thing with bookshops because I like that aspect as well.
true.
And I think that it's also so nice for readers to be able to virtually attend events across the
Hmm.
world. I know I've done it, like gone and watched things
Yeah.
with
Me too.
yeah, authors that I wouldn't get to see otherwise, and I think that's really rewarding.
Well, hopefully in the future there's sort of like a good mix of the two. So it's like now we realize
Fingers
how
crossed.
important virtual events are,
Hmm.
and that kind of thing keeps happening. All the while, physical book tours or physical bookstore events and that kind of stuff gets all intermingled in there in a very nice spread. But before we get into the Jasmine Throne and the Oleander Sword and more of your work, I like to ask this question early on just to give listeners and
Hmm.
viewers a bit more of a sense of you and your history with SFF. But what was it like growing up in terms of reading, in terms of sci-fi, fantasy, that kind of thing for you?
Um, I got into it, I think, fairly early. So I will say I started getting interested in SFF, I think, in a way a lot of people did with things like anime and
Mm,
cartoons
me
that I watched.
too.
But my mum was always a really big reader, and although I read like children's fantasy, so things like Narnia, Peter Pan, all of those kind of things, I stumbled into adult fantasy pretty early. So I went to buy her a birthday present as a kid. So my dad gave me the cash, and I
Hmm.
went shopping. And I picked up the books I thought looked interesting in the adult section. So I think I bought the first book in the Millennium series by David Eddings, who I know is now a controversial figure. But at the time, that was like there was a princess on the cover. She was encased in crystal. Very excited about that, so I picked that up. And also Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett.
Nice.
And I think that was like a really nice introduction to fantasy because I had what was semi-traditional kind of epic fantasy with a grizzled, world-weary protagonist, and sort of caricatures of different nations, and big politics and swords and sorcery. Then I also had kind of the really clever, funny stuff that Terry Pratchett did so well. And half the jokes went over my head, but what I did pick up made me think, wow, fantasy's smart, fantasy's clever. And both of those made me love fantasy, and after that I couldn't be stopped.
Oh, that is a really, really good introduction in terms of like, yeah, you had that duality. And I think Terry Pratchett, if you pick up Terry Pratchett really young and you start to there's something about like humor and satire. If you are at an age where you're still kind of developing emotionally and mentally and that kind of stuff, and you realize like, oh, this book like clicks with me and I get the jokes and everything like that, you feel this
Yeah.
greater sense of satisfaction when you realize like I'm in, like I get it, because there are a lot of books that flew over my head when I was younger, and then I went back and read them. I was like, "Holy crap, it's just like far
I
surpassed my memory of what I was capable of understanding at that age or whatever."
I also think at that age you kind of get determined to become the person who will understand it at some
Yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was reading it and going, I don't get this joke, but I will. And then I went back and I was like, yes, now I understand.
Just that relentless attitude when you're younger. It's just
Yes.
like this is like naive determinism. But after getting introduced to fantasy in this way, how did that relationship sort of progress and eventually to the point where you became a writer?
Oh, I just really loved fantasy. So I was reading a lot of it, and I can't remember any particular books now, but a lot of kind of still a lot of children's fantasy books, a lot of the adult fantasy books. I definitely read all of the kind of big pulp fantasies I could get my hands on. So anything in the
Mhm.
library, anything at my school library, all the Terry Pratchett's my mum owned. Um, a lot of sort of paranormal romance I probably shouldn't have been reading. And then YA fantasy when that became more of a thing as well. So I just read everything, and I found that I'd wanted to be a writer from a very very young age before I could actually really write. Because I think you go through a phase where you're like, I'm going to be a teacher, I'm going to be a fireman, I'm going to be a witch, just the full range of life options. And I settled on writer because I thought that stories were amazing, and I thought, oh, writing stories would be amazing. I didn't know anything more than that. And I remember writing my first stories before I knew how capital letters worked or full stops, because I remember having a tantrum at my parents because I said, why didn't you tell me this? Because now I have to go edit. I have to edit my work now. This is no longer a good story. Um,
That's amazing though
yeah.
that you had this grammar freak out when you were younger, and like
Yes, I was so angry about it.
that set you up perfectly to become a professional writer, because it's like you have to revise,
Yes.
you have to edit, you have to understand how to do that stuff.
Yeah, and I was already a perfectionist who was angry about not doing a good job, so that was great. But yeah, so I kept reading fantasy, kept getting really into it, and then at some point, I think I was applying to university, and I got onto an English and creative writing course, which didn't necessarily make me a writer, but it did introduce me to thinking critically about fiction. And I remember that was the moment that I read N.K. Jemisin for the first time, and I read Marjorie Liu for the first time, and a few other authors, and I started thinking, oh, I could actually write fantasy that draws from things that I'd always imagined fantasy the way it was written, the way I'd always read, so a kind of medieval fantasy. I didn't think, it didn't even occur to me that there could be fantasy with people who looked like me or had, that had overt non-Western influences. I know that they're
Right.
kind of an undercurrent in a lot of fantasy, but not the center. Um, And then when I started seeing the work of authors who were doing that and getting introduced to that, because that's harder to get hold of, or it was at the time, um, I thought, oh, maybe I could do this. And then it took me a number of years after that before I actually accomplished that goal. But it kind of opened my eyes to the possibilities.
That's amazing. And so when you were approaching, I'm not sure if Empire of Sam was your first novel that you ever wrote or just your first published novel, but how did you approach it from the context of what you just said? Like there's the possibility of writing fantasy about people like me, about
Mhm,
people from
mhm.
my heritage, from South Asia, what have you. And I know you're really big into history, especially South Asian history. I love history myself, but that's kind of an area that I'm sorely lacking in terms of like all the different empires. Other than the Mughal Empire, I'm kind of like, shit. It
Oh,
racked my brain trying to
no, no, don't
think
don't
of it,
worry. Like I will say that I'm married to a history teacher who
Oh,
does not
perfect.
teach. Yeah, she doesn't teach South Asian history particularly, though she does touch on the Mughal era now and again, because that comes
Okay.
under the helping children to contextualize the British Empire.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's very
but
helpful for you in terms of research.
yeah, but oddly she wasn't teaching it at the time I wrote it, which would have been really useful.
Yeah.
But I think for me, my relationship with history is that, if someone quizzed me, I'd probably not be very good.
Mm.
Because I remember not loving history at school because I couldn't do the dates. I would get lost on like certain details. So it's a love relationship. It's a hobby relationship. Like I read it for joy, and I can't give you dates for anything, so don't ask me for that. But I think it's sometimes I think that a lot of fantasy is rooted in history. So it's about us trying to explain things that matter to us now using historical motifs or symbols or mythology, or political movements or things what happened, I guess, and using that to make secondary world settings. And I think you see that in Tolkien. You see that, in even I'd say like Brandon Sanderson or Sarah J. Maas. You see like little medieval elements and things like that, and that all comes in. That's my theory. So when it came to writing my own work, I actually wrote a contemporary kind of fantasy YA as my first story, but I finished writing that and went, oh, it's not good, so I just left it. And then I thought, I really love secondary world fantasy. I love romantic fantasy as well.
Hmm.
So let's try it. But I couldn't quite get my head around writing an Indian fantasy world. I didn't really know how to do it. And then I thought, I'm going to do what many great fantasy authors have done before me, and I'm going to use history as an in. So I did a lot of research on the Mughal era, and I picked that one partly because there are a number of English language texts available to look at, which I needed, and also because it was the setting of a lot of the films that I grew up loving. So my dad used to be a Bollywood actor, not a big one, but he was
Still
in
though,
Bollywood.
that's really
I
cool.
know, it's really cool, right? But he loved films like Mughal Azam and Umrajan and and Bakiza, which are not all Mughal films, but draw from a kind of Islamic history.
Mm.
And he introduced me to Mughal Azam in particular, which is a Mughal film, as you can tell from the title. And I loved that film. I would watch it over and over again. And he would talk to me about the history and he would talk to me about the cinematography and things like that because he loved that kind of thing. And I thought, these are the things that I love, so I'm going to draw from the bit of history that I love. So that's what I did. So I did a huge amount of research, and then I started writing the book. And then what I found is, for the sake of the fantasy, I scrapped a lot of the real research I did.
Yeah.
Like I did so much research into economy and politics and this and that. And then for the sake of the story, a lot of those things changed. So although it's a Mughal-inspired fantasy, in many ways it differs. But that was a lovely kind of into creating a fantasy world, which I'm really glad I did. And it meant that later on, when I hit things like the Jasmine Throne, which I know we'll get to later, I felt I could be a lot more free and I could draw more broadly from history and create more of a kind of mashup that isn't real but has that kind of feeling of something real that a lot of fantasy that I think we all love really has.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's really cool that your dad was a Bollywood actor because I could just hear the passion in your voice when you're talking about that. It's kind of this like charming thing, like my parent is really into such and such thing, but to have been an actor in Bollywood, regardless of whether he was in major or minor roles or whatever, the fact that he was telling you about the history and the cinematography and all these different things is really awesome. And I imagine for him it was a sense of pride about being from India, being from South Asia. And for you personally, having that South Asian heritage, but living in the UK, what does it mean to you to be able to represent your heritage through this fantastical lens?
Well, oh, it's interesting actually, and not to bring it downer, but he died before any of my books came out.
Oh, no, I'm
But
sorry.
yeah, it's okay. But it's so he was born and raised in India. He didn't come here until he was an adult. And so he was always very close to his family there. My mom came when she was about 8. And so she had a different experience from him, but they both were essentially, first gen, coming to the UK, having experiences of dealing with assimilation, racism, engaging with a certain community, um, and all of those kind of things. So I was born here, and I think I always found it really difficult because I am South Asian, I'm British Indian or British Asian, But there is a real sense of dislocation because you kind of think you're not really Indian. Because I'm not Indian. I wasn't born there. I wasn't raised there. I don't live under the political climate that's there. But at the same time, it is part of my cultural heritage, and more importantly, it's also part of my lived experience. Like there is a big
Hmm.
South Asian community in the UK. And actually that's not even a fair term. Like South Asian encompasses so many different communities. So
Yeah.
I grew up in a kind of mixed Hindu, Punjabi, and Hindu Sikh. I'm sorry, Punjabi Sikh community. Hindu Sikh doesn't make any sense. Um, and that meant that I was very much embedded in that culture. So I would say that partly through writing the book, actually, I kind of came to embrace that I had a right to tell these stories about a fantasy world that isn't real India, because I was drawing from my experiences and the stories I heard and the inheritance I had as a British Asian person in the diaspora. Um, which is a long way of saying I feel like I write from the diaspora experience. I write as someone
Yeah.
who is not in the source land, but is nonetheless in an Asian community that has a real lived experience of Asianness beyond India. And it was nice to kind of claim that by writing my story and or writing all the stories I've written. And what has been nice about that is I get to feel like I'm speaking to something in myself and hopefully saying something that is interesting or enjoyable for other people who are also in the diaspora.
Mm.
Um, that's the hope, anyway.
No, I mean it totally makes sense. And for me,
Hmm.
it's like obviously I'm coming from an outsider's perspective, but it's like I think a lot of this is cultural cross pollination in a sense, and it's like
Yeah.
for me to understand your experience is to understand the you know former British colonial diaspora, like you said, and the fact that there is this sort of disconnect is really prevalent. And my family, going back a few generations, is from the UK. My mom was born in Wales, and so I've been to the UK a bunch of times, and that's something that is really obvious if you're walking around the streets and you come to these different neighborhoods and there's this different cultural and ethnic makeup. And I think that's really important. And I'm glad that there are authors who are approaching it from that viewpoint and writing stuff that is true to their experience. And I recently talked to Samit Basu, and I think he mentioned your name actually in terms of
Oh,
like
cool.
what he's
Yeah.
happy about in terms of Indian representation in the SFF space, and how there are people from India, from the source land, as you say, but there are also people from other parts of the world who have Indian heritage or South Asian heritage and are using their history and their heritage as a way of giving more understanding to the world through a fantastical lens. But I think it's really important.
Right, that is wonderful, and I love his work, so I'm really glad he mentioned me. And it's also like one of the things that I discovered writing, actually my YA book, and I won't go into that a lot, is how storied the history of South Asians in Britain has been,
Yeah.
and in the wider diaspora, and that we are, as a group, a huge presence across the world with a really big range of cultures. I mean, India itself is full of so many different communities.
Yeah.
There isn't really one singular Indian experience, never mind the entirety of South Asia. And then you have, Indo-Guyanese people, you have Gujarati people from Kenya. We're all South Asian, but we're all very different in terms of our histories and our cultural backgrounds and our beliefs and everything. And that's kind of great, I think.
Hmm. And then it even gets even crazier when you think about like pre 1949, like pre partition, and the fact that there were so many, like the localization of dialects and cultural
Hmm.
groups
Hmm.
and stuff like that was so different than what it is today. And then after 1949, the British just kind of like drew a fucking line through the map, and things got really really messy afterwards.
Oh yeah, yeah, extremely messy. I can't say that I it. Bleh, sorry, that was a bit of word vomit there, but it's complicated because I both know less about the political situation than I should, and also it was a lived experience in my family because of course I'm Punjabi, and Punjabis were largely based around, um, and continue to be based around, Punjab in India, but also Punjab in Pakistan, which is kind of, culturally we have a huge amount in common, but we're
Yeah.
also very distinct communities and It's complicated.
It's very complicated,
Very
but
complicated. Yeah.
speaking of complicated, using history in your works, however loose it ends up being and however you end up playing with
Mhm.
it, what does it allow you to do from the standpoint of things like world building or characters? But on the flip side, what are some of the constraints that come from using that history in your work?
Oh, so I think the nice thing about using history, is that history is so much weirder and more complicated than people
Yeah.
realize.
Yes.
So I think, when you look at something like, and I'm going to use this example, even though I think actually he did exactly the opposite of what I'm about to describe.
Okay.
George R. R. Martin, you look at history in Game of Thrones and you go, oh, maybe that's what the medieval era looked like. That's
Mm.
kind of without the dragons, it was
Yeah.
broadly this.
And the White Walkers
Um,
and stuff.
yeah, or, like there's a few zombies wandering through. But when you
Yeah.
actually dive into the medieval era and the way that people lived and the politics and the weirdness of it, you go, oh God, it was really complex and nuanced and different. And there were lots of things going on that we don't necessarily talk about today, like the whole um, oh God, I really don't know enough about the medieval period to make this point, but things like femme sole, the idea that you had women who were very independent, ran their own businesses, that, for example, people who were serfs or peasants would get married much later than we expect. We expect child marriage because of the kind of things we see in fantasy and grimdark, but actually people would get married a lot older because they would then be established and be able to have families and etc. If I'm wrong about any of this, please nobody come for me. Um, but but I will caveat that with I think George R. R. Martin was actually doing something interesting and different and responding to a pre-existing idea of the medieval, and then he brought in a lot more grit, and that was really innovative. But now, because things have built on his work, we look back and go, looks
Yeah.
kind of generic, and it's
It's like
not.
the
But yeah,
redundancy of the source material. It's a really unfortunate case with a lot of
yes,
things. It's like, yeah,
um,
this has been reiterated so much that people, if they haven't read George's work or they've been like brought up on Joe Abercrombie and then they go back to the Song of Ice and Fire books, it's like, yeah, this feels like well tread ground and doesn't
yeah,
really
you
feel
almost have to
fresh
read
and
backwards from him and see what came before him and go, oh
yeah,
wait, look how cool this thing he did was.
exactly.
Like, and how we should be, I don't want to say thanking, but we should see the history, like, and
Hmm.
how the work today has built on the work. Every kind of piece of fiction is a conversation with fiction that came before it. But
Yeah.
sometimes if you want in that conversation when it happened, it doesn't look like you can't follow the thread,
Yeah.
essentially. Um, but what did I mean by that? Yeah. So anyway, it's that sense that well, when you look at history, you can do really interesting things and be quite original because history is so weird. And you can just pluck certain threads. So if you don't follow
Mm,
kind of the narrative that other writers have built before you, if you purposely pull from something else and bring it in, it can be quite interesting. Um, and I say that because I think that when a lot of writers draw from history, you start having a kind of shared language of what history was, even if it kind of starts veering from the truth. And you
mm,
see that, for example, in a lot of Regency romances. That you have this vision where there are quite a lot of dukes, but there were definitely not actually very many dukes.
yeah.
And the Regency and Georgian eras were just awful for most people, but we only see this small bit of it. And that's fine because it's a fantasy. But if you want to be different, you can draw from something else and bring that in, and that will kind of bring a different voice in. Um, yeah, so you can be original, you can be different. I think the kind of constraint is that when you're drawing from history, even though I think in fantasy you can kind of go off the rails and do different things, and that's the point of fantasy, you have to keep something in that makes it feel true to that era you're drawing from. Something about the vibes or the feeling. And unfortunately, vibes or the feeling is quite vague. So it's quite hard to know what you need to keep in to keep that feeling in place.
Yeah, and maybe that vibe or feeling is something that you have to feel in an intuitive sense as a writer because the reader will pick that up or
Yeah,
they will
yeah.
notice if it's glaringly disjointed or what have you. And I'm really curious, like, building on what you'd written before with the Books of Amba duology and then approaching the Burning Kingdoms,
Mhm.
with this kind of vibe feeling thing in mind, what were some of those initial ideas that brought this world to life and what were some of the historical aspects that you loosely drew upon for it
In the Books of Amber or in the Burning
in the Burning
Kingdoms?
Kingdoms?
So I did draw a little bit on the Mughal era and the Burning Kingdoms. Particularly, I was inspired by the War of Succession for the throne um, between oh God, which siblings was it? Darashikoh, Aurangzeb, and their sister Jahanara Begum, who didn't actually get the throne and wasn't interested in it, but interceded between them significantly. So this was a particular fight between some Mughal brothers for the throne. And I think it's really interesting if you ever want to look into it.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so in that you have the eldest, the was he the eldest? Because they didn't go on age for succession, but there was one brother who was very spiritual, very much into mysticism, who was the sort of the one that everybody arguably people wanted to inherit, who was very gentle, which is reflected in the Burning Kingdoms, I think. And then you have the one who was very religious and fanatical and severe, and he was a lot more ruthless than his other brother. And then you have the sister who was just really smart and kind of played a real game to try and make sure that the brother she wanted to win would win. He didn't, but she nonetheless succeeded quite well for herself.
Very
So
cool.
I changed that because obviously I made the girl win, and I also made her not get on with either brother particularly well. But yeah, so I drew from that. But then I also, when I started thinking about writing it, it was originally going to be part of the Books of Ambha, so it was going to be in that Mughal setting. So of course I drew from that particular conflict. But my editors and I realized quite quickly that it needed to be a much bigger story. It wasn't really going to be a one-book romance. It was a 3-book subplot romance with many, many points of view and lots of other things going on. So it really couldn't work in that series. It had to be something else. And I thought, if I'm going to make, and I almost went, how can I write another Indian fantasy world? And I thought, now I'm being ridiculous because, again, Indian history, vast, Indian culture, vast. I think I can pretty much create a totally different world from in the same space, arguably, the same imaginary space. So I started thinking about the things that I wanted to draw on, and I thought of things like immediately the religious stories I grew up on. So I was raised partly Hindu, partly Sikh, but I grew up on the Mahabharata, which is this humongous religious epic about the fight, arguably for the throne of a country, and there are gods involved, and there is politics and vengeance, and all sorts of stuff happens. A huge war happens as well. It's good fun, very gruesome.
All the juicy stuff that everyone
Yeah,
wants
all
in
the
an
juicy
epic.
stuff. And I also thought about a few other religious stories and how I felt about the women in those stories, because I think putting women at the center of fantasy is something that I really love to do, and their lives and their roles. So in the Mahabharata, there is a woman who's married to 5 men. She doesn't want to be complicated, and she is her oldest husband gambles her away and gambles away the freedom of all his brothers, who are all married to her. Bear with me. So she gets dragged by the king or the prince of this particular nation, who isn't one of her husbands, into this hall, and he wants to dishonor her. And honor is a huge deal for a princess of any ancient era. So he begins to attempt to disrobe her, but essentially a god intercedes on her behalf to protect her. But she is absolutely furious and humiliated, and lots of other terrible feelings about this. So she undoes her hair, and she says that she will not tie up her hair again until she can bathe it in his blood. And I thought, I
Damn.
like her. Yeah, that's
That's a
some
really good
metal
line.
vibes. So, so I named Marlini somewhat after her, because she's called Drupti, but Garland Bearer was one of the things that she was referred to as, or Marlini, and so that was the name I gave to Marlini. And there's a lot of stuff about fire, purity, good womanhood. There's the concept of sati, or women burning. These are all things that exist in history, in both in mythology and reality. And I wanted to draw on them in the story and use those as influences. So I did. And in terms of feeling, I think that the nice thing to go back to your actual question is that there is such a history of mythological retellings and TV shows in India. So I grew up watching those with my grandma. She was well into them. And they are religious television, essentially, but they have a feel and a look that feels fantastical, even though it's religious. and I wanted to draw a little bit on that feel and that look and bring that to the page. So that's kind of the approach I took. I'm not drawing from a particular period of history, but then there is so much media out there that isn't drawing from a particular piece of history either, that I could kind of do that.
That's really cool. Cause yeah, reading these books, it does have a very unique atmosphere to it. And I love how you pull these elements from history into what sounds like a lot of the foundation for Malini as a character.
Hmm.
But on the flip side, how did you approach her love interest, Priya, and where was she born out of?
Priya, funnily enough, turned up quite early in the story. So when I was trying to think of what this book would be, before I decided anything else, I kind of just knew that Priya would be there. And I kind of, with characters, I kind of know how they feel from the inside before I know a lot more about them, kind of how they stand, how they hold themselves. And I knew that she was kind of petite but strong, but kind of very grounded in a lot of ways. For all her great trauma, she's quite a grounded character, who kind of goes her own way, even when it would be more sensible not to do that. So she wasn't necessarily drawn from any kind of mythological source in terms of personality, in terms of nature. She's just sort of turned up in my head, which isn't a great answer, but is true. A lot of the mythology went into her powers, of course. That was a lot more researched and planned, but her actual personality just sort of turned up.
That's awesome though, because I love when characters. I mean, this has happened to me as well in terms of my own writing. Like characters just come out of the blue, and they just like morph into something completely unexpected in your head, and then you realize like, wow, I'm very blown away by whatever happened here in terms of like creativity that I wasn't consciously aware of, or things like that. And you mentioned that it's important for you to have female lead characters and to
Mhm.
reflect something that's often overwritten in a lot of history, which is the women. And so for you, what kind of meaning did you put into creating female POVs, but also POVs who are, as you said, very powerful. They have very strong and often dramatic character arcs and that kind of thing. But then you also have that sapphic romance that's kindling between them. So, what kind of meaning do you get from creating these characters and putting them on the page? And then also, how did you approach putting them together while also giving them individually satisfying arcs?
Oh, that's a big one. So I know it feels like, so I say that writing women's stories is very important to me, and it is. But it's also kind of just what I enjoy. And I think that when we talk a lot about the decisions we make, I think it's important to also emphasize that sometimes what you write is just what you write because it makes you happy.
Yeah.
Like I love a good, swords and sorcery with a male protagonist. It's not a sort of like I will only take this. And I think
Yeah.
and I wouldn't want somebody to sort of write a book that was all women if that wasn't something they wanted to do. I think that it has to come from somewhere inside you. Um, and the ideal and the nice thing is that we're kind of finally, hopefully, getting to a place where there is interest and focus in having a plurality in fantasy, where we can have a lot more voices and a lot more interesting stuff going on. But anyway, that aside, I a lot of the fantasy I've always loved has been focused on women. So I read Kushiel's Dart when I was far too young to read it. Sent
Again.
Jacqueline Carey some. I sent
Paranormal
Jacqueline
romances,
Carey.
all this stuff.
Well, it was like, big erotic political, fantasy,
Yeah.
with a sapphic romance in it, as well as the one between Jocelyn and Phaedra, the kind of the central not heterosexual, because neither of them are really, but the male female romance. And yeah, I sent Jacqueline Carey fan mail when I was like 15. Poor woman. I hope she's forgotten about that. But yeah, I loved that focused on somebody who wasn't traditionally powerful. You have, for those who don't know it, a courtesan who is a masochist as the main character. She's also a spy. And she ends up in horrible situations, but uses this position where people think she's powerless to get information and accomplish great deeds. So that had a huge influence on the way I wrote women, because I thought, I love politics. I love the idea of taking a gender role that is generally considered um, one in which you're powerless, and looking at the power inherent in there, or the possibilities of power. So that impacted me. And I also loved a lot of, YA fantasy, and that focuses a lot on women as well, or girls. And I really loved a lot of paranormal romance, which also focuses a lot on women, funnily enough, because they're half the story in those. So all of that kind of informed what I cared about when I came to the page. In terms of making interesting and strong women with different perspectives, I think, again, looking at history, you find those women a lot. If you look at the Mughal era, for example, you have a lot of interesting and politically powerful women, but the way they've been interpreted is often as weak or conniving or
Mm.
temptresses. So there are quite biased interpretations of Nur Jahan, for example, who was essentially a de facto empress because her husband, the emperor, was an addict and was not really in a position to rule. Um, and there's a lot of like, oh, she was conniving. She brought her brothers and uncle and father into power. She just had her finger in all the pies. And I thought, reading that, well, that's pretty sensible, really. She's
Yeah.
she's a woman in a culture and a situation which she cannot show her face. She's in Burda, so she needs to have men that she can trust in positions of power in order to pull the strings of power.
Hmm.
This is a very logical decision that this woman made.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, and there's a lot of those kind of things that if you look in history, you find these women who did interesting, politically interesting or otherwise things, and I just sort of drew on those as well to kind of influence my own stories. In terms of the Sapphic romance, um, I love a good Sapphic romance, and it was important to me to kind of bring that onto the page. And I think as a queer South Asian woman, I wanted to write a romance that I hadn't seen in many places that would speak to something in me and then maybe would speak to some of my readers as well. So that was really nice to be able to do.
Yeah, and I think it works really well for the story that you wanted to tell because it's like these very strong personalities, very different personalities. Like Malini and Priya are very, I mean, on one hand, like there's this undercurrent of ruthlessness with Malini, this very strong personality, but then her figure kind of presents this more diminutive presence that people underestimate her a lot. And then Priya with her magic and how that develops and everything like that goes from a very lowly position to a position of power. So it's really a cool dynamic. And I'm curious how, in terms of how you approach the writing process and how you
Mhm.
approach your characters, how do you find that right balance between things like the romance and the relationships versus the action and the conflict and the bigger driving forces of a narrative?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I don't know if I think that you I don't know that there is a right answer to that because I think that every author does a different balance, and there's always going
Mm,
to be readers who find the balance off. Um, so for me, it's always very important to center emotional beats. I will choose emotion over pacing nearly any time, unfortunately. So if I wanted to, I don't always necessarily want to dive into romance as the big beat that I'm hitting, and it was
mm,
important for me to explore their relationship, but it wasn't the only beats that I had to hit in that book. So there's a lot of family stuff in the story as well,
yeah.
a lot about siblings. So in the first book, in the Jasmine Throne, you have Malini has been sent. She is a princess of Parajadvipa, this empire. She has been sent in exile to this ruin of a temple where many, many years ago, a bunch of powerfully gifted children were burned to death. It's not a very nice place for her to be, because she refused to burn after betraying her brother, the emperor. And she is so she doesn't really get on with her brother because he wants her dead, and vice versa. And she also has another brother who she wants to take the throne because in this patriarchal society, a man should take it. She wants him to do it because that way she can get her other brother off the throne. They all have a very complicated familial relationship that is very toxic. Priya, on the other hand, looks like she's an only child, but she also has some very complicated sibling relationships to contend with. And I really wanted to explore family and what it means when the adults who are meant to protect you betray you and what that
Mm,
does to you as an adult, what it means to be an adult trying to make the world better when you have no models for what a better world looks like, um, what it means when you love somebody but perhaps not enough, or your ideals come before your love, or your idea of love is extremely destructive. So all of those things kind of came in. And I guess centering those beats, that idea of what impact do these different feelings have on these characters was the most important thing to me. So there are events that happen in the book, of course, but it was focusing on those different relationships that really matter to me.
Hmm.
So that was
Yeah.
where my weight of the story went. Whereas I think perhaps things like a fast pace suffered as a result of that. But that's the
Eh,
kind of payoff you have to make in every book.
exactly, exactly. And at the same time, I think like the stakes that you were able to develop based on those familial connections was very well tied into the fabric of the world that you created. You know, you have
Mhm.
um the politics and how Malini and her fucked up family relationships are essentially, you know, sending her across the subcontinent, and trying to find her the brother that she wants on the throne, all the while you know, keeping an eye out for her other brother who wants her dead and is keeping her imprisoned. And then you also have Priya, who her familial connections are more tied into the way that nature and magic functions in this world.
Mhm.
And I really love the magic system that you created and how that integrates into aspects of religion and nature and all that kind of stuff. So what was your approach to developing the magic in this world? And then on top of that, how does the magic then reflect the world itself?
Oh, so magic is a funny one. I went a little bit ballistic with the magic systems, I've got to say, because there's quite a few. I actually cut some in the first book, but so you have this magic of fire. The idea that there were women called the Mothers of Flame who, during this time called the Age of Flowers, very fantasy names, um, sacrificed their lives and burned alive in order to create a magic that would destroy the Yuxo, these enemy nature gods, essentially,
Hmm.
that were taking over the subcontinent, and so they were destroyed. So you have this idea of magic as a purity, fire, and sacrifice. Then you also have the people of the nature gods, or the Ariani, who have a different magic system, which is essentially not based on sacrifice, though all of the systems are actually based on
Little
sacrifice.
bits of sacrifice.
Yeah, which is based on the idea that there are nature beings that they worship, and that a small group of children can be reared to be temple elders or priests. They must travel through the deathless waters 3 times, and the strongest of them will survive those journeys and gain magical abilities in the service of their gods. Um, and some of them will die. And so there is a relationship there between the idea that there is strength and there is weakness, and only the strong may survive. Um, and that's also related to waters and the idea of minglings of different waters and things like that. Then you have the worshippers of the nameless god, who believe that your name is a prophecy, so you keep your name secret until it is time for it to be spoken. So a lot of people have sort of monikers or pet names that are used as if they are their real names, but they have secret real names. And all of those things were drawn from things I had read or seen. So, for example, a lot of people get their name from the Sikh holy book, like a
Mm.
certain letter or syllable is picked, and that gives you your name, or your name is picked according to your stars. So in Hinduism, broadly, at least in the part that I'm from. So I thought it would be quite interesting to say, if your names are kind of fated for you, to sort of say, oh, maybe your name's a secret, maybe people can't know. And that kind of influenced that. The fire was drawn from a lot of Hindu lore and belief, and the waters as well. But actually, I always say this: the yaksha are real nature spirits in Hinduism.
Really? Oh,
Um,
very cool.
but yeah, but the way I modeled them was actually based just on Fae. So that wasn't really, yeah, that kind of drew from a different source, because the whole idea of like these powerful nature spirits was a totally different thing. And there's
Hmm.
also this whole thing of the rot, or like plants turning into flesh and flesh turning into plants. And that was influenced by the fact that I used to be a medical librarian, and I would look at a bunch of medical historical textbooks like The Sick Rose, which has a compendium of medical illustrations, bear with me, that look a lot like botanical art illustrations.
Hmm.
There's not much of a difference, and they're really, really uncomfortable to look at, because you're looking at essentially horrible disfiguring diseases drawn in this really beautiful way. And I kind of wanted to play with that, the idea of something beautiful but rotten, a little bit, and so I brought that in as well.
Oh, I love that. That's amazing. Because I love botanical illustrations, just like that really intricate line work and everything like that. And then to see that with disfigurements is kind of this, yeah, this strange paradox of like
Yeah, you should look up The Sick
rotten
Rose,
beauty.
which is like a an anthology of medical art by the Wellcome Trust. I think you might
I'll
like it.
I'll throw that in the show notes so that everyone can check that out. I'll have a link to that. Um, and in terms of the way that you infuse these magic systems into the world, how do you feel that was an effective platform for your characters? And then also, how do those magic systems kind of reflect how you perceive the world that we inhabit, the real world?
Oh, so I think the nice thing about the fire system is quite straightforward because it's kind of, fire and relationships between sacrifice and patriarchy and female purity. So I could play around with that a little bit in the world and in Marlene's journey in understanding her own power and having her own power after being quite put in quite a box. Um, the nature magic that's very related to Priya was a nice way to kind of explore familial trauma and intergenerational trauma, but also finding your own power and deciding whether you are the monster or whether you are the cure
Mm,
in a difficult world. So I don't know that I intentionally thought about how they tied to those characters, but that did come out in the process. But I also think that in terms of how I feel about the real world, um, I think the nature magic is quite interesting in the sense that you can't write about nature magic without people thinking about climate change and ecosystems and the importance of nature, but also how terrifying it is. And so that was quite nice to explore. But broadly, all of the magical systems are related to religion, and I think that some of my complicated feelings about religion and faith show through in the way that I write religion and faith. And I'll just leave it at that because I think people should make their own interpretations on that one.
perfect. We'll leave it at that. And after the momentous events of the Jasmine Throne, I felt personally that you really raised the stakes in the Oleander Sword, and there was a lot in terms of more brutality, more battles, and like more military interactions and that kind of thing. The scale is a lot larger than the Jasmine Throne, which I think works in the sense of the goals are larger. And so, how was it for you in terms of expanding on what you had started in the first book, on things like the lore and the history of the world and the characters and the relationships that are going on?
The relationships was fun. Everything else was absolutely terrifying. Because I think I've never written like a trilogy before. I've written a duology, and I thought,
Yeah.
and hitting the second book, you know all about the second book slump. You've read books with it, and I thought I don't want it to slump, but also I have to set up the third book, give a satisfying conclusion to things that happen in the first book, and also make this a fun book to read on its own. And I was like, that's
Yeah.
quite a lot for one book to do. God bless my editor because she helped me so much. And I think that with a larger scale, I sort of had to contend with the fact that there were going to have to be some battles and there was going to have to be military strategy. I know nothing about those things, or I didn't until I hit the book and then I did some research. And I think you have to have a certain level of confidence, I guess, in knowing that you can research things and make them interesting. And I remember at one point my editor said, "How is this happening here?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand how battles work." She was like, "Sorry, but you are going to have to work it out."
You gotta
So I
figure
did.
it.
Yes. And it's that problem of when you write a book about smart people doing smart things and you realize you're not as smart as them, you have to kind of up your game a little bit. But
Yeah.
yeah, to be more serious, I think it was really nice to think about how these events that had happened in a really small space in this one city basically in the first book would then extrapolate out and impact larger parts of the empire. And it was nice to explore other bits of the empire because we go to different bits. We go to Saketa, we go to the capital, funnily enough, and to one of the border countries as well. And that was really nice to kind of dive into the way that the events affect all those places. And
Mhm.
one of the things that happens in the Jasmine Throne is you have a lot of minor points of view. So you see how
Yeah.
events affect minor characters. So how normal people are impacted by this. Largely they die, but you see how it affects them. So it was nice to kind of do that and see how it also affected people in other parts of the empire as you kind of hit
Mm.
the second book.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, one of my personal favorite POVs. You did a great job in both books and sort of like deftly handling multiple POVs. Because I know you said at the beginning when you're conceptualizing the trilogy, you're just like,
Hmm.
there's going to be a lot of POVs. And after reading these books, I'm just like, there are a lot of POVs, but I didn't notice or I didn't mind. It didn't hamper the story in any
Oh,
way.
I'm
And there
glad.
there are certain characters like Bhumika. I'm just like,
I
I
love
love her
her so
so.
much. Yeah.
She's awesome. So good job on that. I just wanted to throw
Oh,
that in
thank
there.
you.
And you mentioned that the relationship aspects were something that were you were a lot more confident about going
Mm.
into book two, and now you're writing book three. But how are you feeling about sort of the ongoing relationship, the intertwining destinies, let's call it, of Priya and Malini?
Um, I knew how, I don't want to spoil it, but I knew where I was going to take it in book two. And then I did. And that was very interesting to write. And I'm looking forward to seeing how people feel about that. But now I'm writing book three, I'm sort of trying to untangle things and get them to where I need them to be. And it will be quite interesting to see whether I succeed in that. Um, but it's also nice to write a relationship between two people, which is not like I love their relationship, but it's also like not perfection. They're not,
No.
they're not necessarily very good for each other, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I think that's nice because I actually love kind of exploring a relationship that's not entirely healthy. Not that any relationship in this world is healthy, but that is in many ways very good for both of them and provides them solace, but is also not very healthy and also has these power dynamics involved that neither of them can control, particularly,
Hmm.
that make it very difficult for them to be honest and trusting and loving with each other. Like it's very difficult to see a way that they can be happy. But I think that reflects other aspects of their lives as well. It's not so much about them both being women as it is about them being who they are and having the powers they have and the political alliances and affiliations that they have. Um, and I enjoy that. I like all of that conflict. I like that idea of these two people desiring and wanting each other and seeing something in each other that they don't see in anybody else, but also being constantly torn apart by that. I think that's fun. I love the angst.
The angst is beautiful. It's kind of like the rot is like a perfect reflection of their relationship in a lot of ways because it's like on one hand it's like the beauty of nature, but on the other hand it's like the corruption of nature and how
Right.
this
Yeah.
relationship enhances the beauty within the other, but at the same time it's just like sometimes it really brings out the worst.
Yes.
and
Yeah. It absolutely does. Yeah.
and it's beautiful. It's just beautiful to watch that because it's like that creates tension and conflict, and that's the kind of stuff that
Mm.
keeps us going, especially when it comes to relationships and stuff like that. And now, with book three coming out next year, I believe, are you already thinking beyond this series, or are you thinking of future books or a series that you want to work on?
Yes. But there's nothing. I have a very clear sense of what I want to write next, but I'm trying to focus on making sure that book three is as good as possible, which is, always vaguely terrifying because you want to do the story justice. Like, I
Yeah.
want to do these characters justice and give them the right ending that they deserve. But I, every time I get stressed out, I think about the next thing that I want to write. And I can't share anything yet, partly because, it doesn't exist yet. It's not in any
It's all there.
capacity. Yeah, it's all up here. But it would be another Sapphic fantasy, but not necessarily Indian. So we'll see. We'll see.
Ooh,
Mm.
cool. Well, very excited to read the next book, the final book in the trilogy. As of yet, I believe it's untitled, doesn't have a release date or anything, but very excited for it nonetheless. And just to close out, if you could share something that you're currently reading, watching, or listening to, anything that you've really enjoyed lately that you want to share with listeners and viewers.
Oh gosh, my brain's gone so blank. I just read Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid, which is a gothic horror novel set in a fantasy setting. And it is as gothic and horrific as you can possibly imagine a gothic horror to be. There are a number of points where I went, oh no, no, oh no. Yes. Um, it's very that. So I think that a lot of people review it and go, check trigger warnings. But I think you know what you're getting into if you read a gothic horror. I think you know. But I really enjoyed it. I think Ava Reid's writing is absolutely beautiful. It's very like The Rot in the sense that it's absolutely gorgeous, and then it will suddenly turn, and then you're like, oh, that was horrible. but beautiful, but horrible. So I can't recommend that book enough.
Amazing. Cool. I really want to check that out. But Tasha, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. And to anyone watching or listening, I highly recommend you go check out Tasha's work, especially the Jasmine Throne and the Oleander Sword. It's amazing and complex and oh so satisfying.
Thank you.
Tasha, if you could please let listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, definitely. And also, thank you so much for having me. It's been
My
lovely.
pleasure.
I'm on Twitter as Tasha Drinks Tea because I like to drink tea, and Tasha Suri on Instagram and on TikTok, and also tashasuri.com if you want my website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.